Hello, everyone. Can everyone hear me okay? Nice projecting. Can everyone online hear me all right?
I'm about to ask.
Awesome. So thank you all for coming today. Really excited to be able to share this paper on FDA approval on property with you. Thank you to CIPLIT and JHLI again for inviting and hosting me. So if you haven't met me before, my name is Knox. I'm a Jaharis Faculty Fellow here, and my research looks at the role of the FDA in access to medicines broadly. And this paper takes a bit of a theoretical doctrinal look really into what is the meaning of FDA approval, what rights does it confer, and what protections do we need. And given some of the current developments at the FDA and HHS, with it being very politicized and there being a lot of regulatory uncertainty, these legal statuses and the protections that attach to them are particularly relevant to look into now. So with this, I first broadly am interested. Is this clicker gonna work?
I think you meant to click on
Hit the cancel.
What?
There's some like message up there.
Yeah.
There we go. So first, just starting with the question motivating this piece is with this legal uncertainty and with the importance of FDA approval in the pharmaceutical market, what legal weight should be given to FDA approval? And with that, based off of what protections we want, what stability we want, and some recent cases that are claiming additional protections in FDA approval, I ask, does it confer property rights? So in this talk, I'll start off by outlining the problem. Why is this relevant? Why is this relevant now? And there's been some developments in the past couple of weeks in particular that make this question even the more important. With that framework of why we care about the meaning of FDA approval, I'll go into some property theories. We're going to ask whether FDA approval is property. We should start off with first year 1L property, look at those theories and see to what extent they fit. Now, I find that they aren't the right fit for FDA approval, given its government origin and some other factors regarding the approval itself. So we need an alternative. For this, I go into new property theory, which is named from Charles Raich's 1964 article, and the Supreme Court's legitimate claim of entitlement doctrine. This provides due process protections for government-created property rights. So I argue under this framework, we can say that FDA approval is a constitutionally protected property interest. So what does that mean? Then I'll go into what are these implications for withdrawal of FDA approval, for granting of FDA approval, for the actions of the agency as a whole, but also more broadly in the market for innovation incentives and for access to medicines. And I'll leave you with some concluding thoughts that are framing where my research is going from here that should be of interest. So to begin, what's the problem? Why do we care? What is the value of FDA approval? So the current state of the FDA, we're seeing quite a bit of flux, particularly under current Secretary of Health and Human Services, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. There's been mass firings or resignations, reduction in force at the FDA, really shifting who is working there and what resources are available for drug approval. But we also have some big changes in terms of the actual regulatory framework and these positions on policy, whether it comes to vaccines, how we're looking at general childhood vaccinations or COVID-19 vaccines. We have changes in terms of how we're thinking certain drugs may be safe or effective. Are we looking at concerns around Tylenol? Are we looking at some other new withdrawals going on? So a lot of this is just leading to a time of regulatory uncertainty in terms of the rights that companies are getting in their FDA approvals. And this is relevant not only for the company, but for patients. Can you be secure in your access to vaccines, in your access to drugs after FDA approval? So this leads us first to, in this time of FDA approval, and I face this every time teaching FDA law, how do I go about teaching these issues in a time where there's so much uncertainty, so much change at the FDA? So how do we respond to these current challenges and this changes in trust, this lack of trust in FDA's authority and FDA's decision-making? But this goes further in terms of these actions. We've seen some pushback on COVID vaccines, but also in recent years, we've seen an increasing number of actions where the FDA is withdrawing drug approvals and the manufacturers are pushing back. Historically, this has been very rare, but we've seen a few cases at all, having their N being greater than 0 is significant here, where companies are saying, no, I defend my drug's safety, its effectiveness. I want to keep it on the market. And just a couple of weeks ago, the FDA said that it wanted to withdraw a rare disease drug, Tabneos, and it said, no, we are confident in this drug. We are going to keep it on the market. So they're challenging FDA's withdrawal request. So this leads us to two different questions. One, in the case of these controversial medications, this pushback of FDA, what protections do we want for these FDA-approved medications? What are we going to do about some of these controversial medications and these controversial decisions? But more broadly is also the question of what is the legal status of FDA approval? Now, there's pushback and trust, there's pushback, there's been ongoing controversies at the agency, but nonetheless, both nationally and globally, FDA is still considered the gold standard of drug approvals, the gold standard of pharmaceutical regulation. We're the model of other agencies across the globe in figuring out how they're going to approve and review drug applications. So manufacturers rely on this. They take it as their ticket to the market, their key to access the pharmaceutical market, yet there's more instability. Nonetheless, when there's changes to a manufacturer's approval, manufacturer's decision, companies in recent years have increasingly claimed property rights in whole or in part of their FDA approval. Whether it be saying that their NDA, their new drug approval, means that they have a license to market and a property interest in that, whether they have a property interest in certain exclusivity rights, or they have a property interest in some of the underlying data. Now, all of these cases have been decided on other grounds and really left this fundamental question of what is FDA approval, what rights are attached to it, and what protections attached to FDA approval. All of those questions remain open. So this is where my analysis of whether FDA approval constitutes a property right begins. And why does this matter? First, if we have FDA approval recognized as a property right, it shapes our understanding of FDA approval rights. What can FDA do? What type of reliance interests can a manufacturer hold in their property, in their FDA approval? And what authority does the FDA have to regulate, to change labeling, to deny an approval, to withdraw a drug, to add different safety programs? This really shapes not only what the FDA can and cannot do, but what incentives are provided and what manufacturers can reasonably expect based on receiving an FDA approval. And more broadly, really in line with my research overall on access to medicines, knowing that an FDA approval means a key to the market, a stable and ability to rely on the ability to continue selling your product is really key for both manufacturers and their investments to make a drug available, but also for patients. You want to be able to know that this is FDA approved. I will be able to access it. I know what is coming. I have a stable regulatory environment. So with these in mind, I turn to what is a way to add more regulatory certainty, more regulatory stability in these contexts when either FDA approvals are going to be withdrawn or there's just other changes at the FDA. So this is the question of, is FDA property? So starting, we have to say, what is property in the first place? And that's shaped by different theories. The most obvious place to start is with our traditional theories of property that we hear the first class or two in 1L property, that being the right to exclude, the bundle of sticks, and then more broadly, and relevant for this audience, intellectual property. Do we want to frame FDA approval as a type of property we see traditionally with land and chattels, or put it akin to patents and copyright? So just to reiterate these theories to make sure we're all on the same page, you can look at the right to exclude theory as the very traditional, it's the sine qua non of property. You have the right to exclude others from your interest, your thing, and then you have a property right. This exclusion and the right to actually exercise affirmatively that exclusion from the market or from use of your interest is the key to this theory. Throughout property theories, throughout history, property theorists and scholars have extended the right to exclude to recognize the other types of interests that are also seen in property rights. This is where we get the bundle of sticks, where we think of rights to transfer and sell your property to another. The right to use your property and build a house on your land, or to enjoy the benefits from your patent or your other invention. This is looking at the bundle of sticks, the bundle of individual rights that you see combined, the ability to exercise those rights being property. And then finally, we want to think about FDA approval potentially in the context of intellectual property. We're thinking about pharmaceutical innovation incentives, pharmaceutical competition, FDA approval, and the regulatory exclusivities and marketing rights that are attached to it are all central to whether you can innovate, whether you can enter a market and protect that innovation. So similar to other intellectual property, which is where we are rewarding and promoting science and the useful arts, having limited exclusive rights associated with these inventions, FDA approval has some similarities there. It's designed in a way to incentivize the development of certain products. It's set in a way where you had to put all this investment to generate loads of data on safety and effectiveness and the ability to manufacture this product. And then you get some rights to sell based off of that investment. Now, starting here is the place to logically start if we're using a property framework. But for several reasons, FDA approval doesn't neatly fit within any of these property theories. For the right to exclude and exclusion throughout, FDA approval doesn't have that traditional ability to enforce exclusive rights. While manufacturers have the right to be the only drug on the market and not have generic competition, all of those rights of non-generic approval, of other companies not coming in and competing, it's enforced only by the FDA. So this is an agency-driven and government-driven right as opposed to a private law, common law-driven exclusivity. So this is fundamentally different than we think of in terms of land, where you can keep others off your land, keep others from using your vehicle or reading your book. And in bundle of sticks, not only is that traditional right to exclude not there, but there's limitations on the right to transfer your product. There's FDA regulations in terms of that sale and how it can be used or not used after a transfer. There's limitations on the use, on the possession, who can actually be effectively in charge of these FDA approvals. Can it be any company? Maybe, maybe not. So particularly with the exclusivity, the bundle of sticks and right to exclude don't quite fit. And while I have shown that there is a lot of intellectual property, innovation, incentive, and reward aspect to FDA approval, that's first not this consistent across the board. It's more in place for certain types of rare disease drugs, neglected tropical disease drugs, special programs. But also it's secondary. While there is this reward for the development of a new drug and bringing it to market and making this investment, the real focus of FDA approval is judging it as safe and effective for the market. It's this marketing rights. It's this public health consumer protection role. So if we're going to have FDA approval just be lumped in with other intellectual property, it really would not recognize the central driving force behind the FDA as an institution and the approval itself for the market. So this leaves us with, okay, there's certain aspects of FDA approval that we want to have protections for that are property-like at the very least. It has some innovation incentive. It has some rights for the manufacturer. It is this license to sell a life-saving product to the market, and we want to ensure that there is that stability, there is that protection for FDA approval. But clearly these theories aren't fitting. So where else can we go? One of the issues that I started to highlight, particularly with the right to exclude, was this government source. Traditionally for property with land, with chattels, there's this private law, common law origin. Here, this is a government created right. So where can we go with government created rights? This is new property. So new property is a term coined by Charles Reich, a Yale law professor, in his 1964 article, definitely going back just a few years. But it's been a very influential piece of scholarship that's been big not only in terms of the analysis of property rights and administrative law, but also in the courts in terms of the protections that are going to be granted and recognized for these government created rights. The thrust of the new property was that the government was playing a greater and greater role in the financial welfare and security of individuals in a way that private property had traditionally been protecting people. People were used to private property protecting their wealth. Now a lot of the wealth, either in terms of welfare benefits, in terms of government franchises and business licenses, all of these were reliant on the government. So Charles Reich had argued that there should be due process protections for these interests because they were so central to individual well-being, individual autonomy, and the financial security of people, and in some cases, smaller businesses. So with this reliance, with this desire for benefits and government protection for these government benefits, he argued for due process protections, which has been influential in the courts to some extent, particularly in the context of various government grants. So this is from a line of doctrine going from the theory itself in the article to the Supreme Court's cases in Goldberg versus Kelly, Board of Regents of State Colleges versus Roth, and Matthews versus Eldridge, all of which recognizing some property interest and property protections in these forms of new property, which the court calls legitimate claims of entitlement. So these are all government created interests, government originated rights, where the court says that to have a property interest in them, they must have a legitimate claim of entitlement to it. It can't be a unilateral expectation. There has to be a clear objective understanding of the right. There has to be a reliance on that right in terms of supporting that expectation. And there has to be limits on the discretion of the government in granting it. And this is what makes it property-like, because it's the purpose of property to protect those claims upon which people rely in their daily lives, reliance that must not be arbitrarily undermined. So how do we identify these property rights? So we've talked about exclusivity and these possession rights and use rights and transfer rights and these key innovation incentives in the traditional property theories, including intellectual property. For legitimate claims of entitlement and other types of new property, courts recognize it based off of this three-part test. Sometimes they're blended together, but this is the clearest way to set it out. First, this is unlike these other private law rights, these other traditional rights in land and things. This is the government created right. So we need to look to statute, to agency regulations to create this right. And further, there has to be an objective expectation of this right. It's not just the government has this program, I want to benefit from it, and I'm going to expect it. There has to be some part of the statute that says you have an expectation that you will receive or continue to receive this right, this benefit. And finally, this has to be a non-discretionary grant of rights. This can't be something that the government can easily change its mind on. It has to have some clear reliance interests and clear guidelines so individuals can continue to rely on this interest and make it so the government's limited in its ability to deprive said rights. So this is how we can determine whether some government created interest rises to the level of a legitimate claim of entitlement, which is eligible for these constitutional protections. So how does FDA approval fit in here? Now, theoretically, a lot of the focus was on welfare benefits, on some more individual support systems. But the new property theory article also extends to public franchises, other business licenses, things where it's not just the individual that relies on it for financial security, but businesses can also rely on it for their continued financial well-being, their continued financial ability to participate in the market. This particularly tracks with FDA approval. Without FDA approval, companies can't sell their product. They're barred from the market. It's illegal to transport these products in interstate commerce. They rely on that. They make all of their investment in developing this drug and continuing manufacturing and making sure that the drug can be made and supplied across the country. This is all done in reliance on that ability to continue participating in the market. Now, this is underlying the legitimate claim of entitlement doctrine, but not an explicit factor in it. We don't look specifically, is there reliance? We look at these three sub-issues. First, is this government created? FDA approval has the agency right in its name. It's created by the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. It's regulated by the FDA, and all the rights that are generated and conferred through an approval are set forth in the statute itself. So first box clearly checked off. Second, is there this objective expectation? The FDA, FDCA sets forth what in the marketing rights, the exclusivity rights, everything that a manufacturer is entitled to based off of their showing of safety and effectiveness. So understanding it throughout the process of developing a drug, manufacturers interact with the FDA, understand what they need to do to meet these requirements, and after receiving FDA approval, they know their ongoing obligations for adverse event reporting, for labeling compliance. They know what they need to do to maintain these approval rights. And it's clear that this is the requirements when you look at the withdrawals of FDA approval. While some are for more specific issues of safety and effectiveness, many are non-compliance with annual reporting, non-compliance with ongoing obligations. So this is where some of the objective expectation and the ongoing requirements can be seen. Now, finally, the last part is FDA approval a non-discretionary grant? So the grant itself has more discretion. That is not itself dispositive. Yes, and a manufacturer needs to show that there is substantial evidence of safety and effectiveness. What that substantial evidence needs, what is the level that rises to substantial evidence, is based off FDA guidance, communications between the FDA and the manufacturer. So those communications alone can give rise to some level of expectation, some level of understanding, some limits on the FDA's discretion. But where we really see this limited discretion in the grant that pushes it to this legitimate claim of entitlement status is in withdrawal. While there is more flexibility in the actual original grant, what we care about is the reliance. Is there discretion in terms of ending this grant and terminating these rights? And there's very narrow circumstances where the FDA can initiate these withdrawal proceedings. It's very specific non-compliance with certain regulations, or it's new evidence that shows it's not safe, it's not effective. So it doesn't mean that there's no discretion in the decision for FDA to grant or withdraw an approval. It means that there is objective limitations in the statute that makes it so the administration can't act arbitrarily and capriciously, tracking a lot of these protective languages we see in the APA. So with this, does it perfectly fit under this framework? No, but that's law. We see that it does meet these requirements and it does fulfill the general goals of promoting welfare, of supporting reliance interests, in protecting individuals' dependence on government-created rights. So I argue in this paper that FDA approval does constitute a legitimate claim of entitlement. This means it's a constitutionally protected property interest and is entitled to protections under the Due Process Clause. So we got all this way here. Now I'm saying FDA approval is property. So the appropriate question here, as well as the title of a great song by Pink, is so what? Why do we care that FDA approval meets the definition of property? So first, due process can require changes to withdrawal procedures. If you're going to terminate this right, if you're going to withdraw a drug from the market when it has already met the requirements, it's demonstrated it meets the statutory requirements for FDA approval, what do you need to do now to terminate that, to take that away? Now, the regulations in the FDCA that set forth the requirements for withdrawal of the procedures generally meet these due process requirements. If you look at Matthews versus Eldridge and several other cases that govern the withdrawal and due process protections of these new property rights, these legitimate claims of entitlement, the notice, the opportunity for a hearing, whether it be pre or post withdrawal, they're generally there. There may be some requirement for additional hearings. The FDA currently has quite a bit of discretion in not holding these hearings. So that may change, but ultimately that's the big place we'll see. If we're going to either literally or effectively withdraw a drug from the market, that's where due process may kick in. But as all my FDA students know, there's many other things the FDA does. It changes labeling, it requires safety programs. What does it mean for the FDA's authority if it has due process obligations here? Because FDA due process attaches specifically for a deprivation of life, liberty, or property, we have to look, is there a deprivation? Now, when we're depriving marketing rights, we're stopping a drug from coming on the market and having these core parts of FDA approval taken away, then yes, we have that deprivation. That's the withdrawal case, or some types of actions that really approach that line. For most of it, for labeling, for safety changes, for manufacturing regulations, this is just another regulatory action. This isn't a deprivation. Think of this in terms of traditional land. We have zoning laws. Those are allowed. We're not taking them away from people. So for due process, there would be some additional requirements, but for the most part, FDA's regulatory authority, its public health purposes would be not changed. For the takings clause, I'll just note this briefly. It only applies to private property. So as I've said, this is a government-created property right. This is distinct from many of the common law and other private law property rights we talk about. And if you look at the cases applying takings or other constitutional protections to legitimate claims of entitlement, they have not found the taking clause applicable. So we're not worried too much, or at least I'm not right now, about takings of FDA approval. What else would this affect? Considering the additional difficulty withdrawing a drug from the market, if there's more withdrawals, as we started to see, if there's more hearings or additional procedures that may be required, then the FDA may be a little bit more cautious in granting approvals if it's going to ultimately be harder to take a drug off the market. So it may affect the speed and some of the decisions of the FDA. Could this lead to a backlog? Maybe, maybe not, but it could change the speed of availability of new drugs. Adding another property right to manufacturers' chest of investment to their collection of rights to protect their innovation, that could potentially somewhat increase innovation incentives. We've seen some push for relying more on protections from the FDA as opposed to patents in pharmaceuticals. If you go that route, then it becomes more and more important, and it would provide additional protections for that. But in the short term, probably no major changes in terms of innovation. It could delay competition somewhat if it's harder to bring generic competition to market, and if manufacturers use this as a way to say, I'm going to stop you from entering the market affirmatively, or try to. And ultimately, for access to medicines and bigger policies in terms of FDA, could add some more stability. It would be harder for major changes in policy to go through that are going to make it harder to get vaccines, make it harder to get certain drugs, make it harder for drugs to be taken off the market or substantially limited. So it could be a positive in terms of access, but on the other hand, what does that mean when the original drug is actually unsafe and companies come in and say, no, we want to keep this unsafe drug on the market? Have we seen many examples of that? No. So am I super concerned that right this second? No, but it is a real possibility that it can already be difficult to get an unsafe drug off the market. If we have additional protections, it could make it even harder than it is right now. So ultimately, we're balancing some regulatory decision-making, some innovation incentives, and some rights to manufacturers and their innovations. So with that, what are the key takeaways? Providing this framework, doing this analysis says that we can see FDA approval as a legitimate claim of entitlement, as a type of new property. This gives us a framework for understanding what is required for FDA regulations, for protecting FDA approvals, for manufacturers that are trying to defend their innovation, as well as for patient groups that are trying to access medications. This gives us more of an understanding where prior to this, there was this open question: is FDA approval property? If so, how is it? What type? What do we care about? This provides us a framework for understanding these questions and addressing them. It also provides some way for us to work towards increased trust and increased legitimacy in the FDA if there is more stability and more protections. And we know that there can't be easily, at least, some of these arbitrary political actions that could stop access to FDA approved medications. And this provides greater context for what we want to think about in terms of future withdrawals of FDA approval. Going back to the example we saw that just came out within the past couple of weeks, what is going to happen with Tavneos? Are they going to require hearings through the FDA? Will FDA grant them? Are they going to be required to grant them? If Tavneos doesn't like the decision afterwards, if Amgen, the manufacturer, doesn't want to take its drug off the market, does it pursue other arguments, other ways to try to keep this drug? And ultimately, is that the right choice? Is this the right level of protection we want? So leave you with an open question of, while we can say FDA approval meets this test for a constitutionally protected property interest, should FDA approval be treated as property? So with that, I thank you. I do a nice little magic trick if my monitor will work, and I'll open it up to questions. Thank you. Yes.
Could you talk a little bit about the FDA's role in assignments? If if someone with an FDA approval wants to transfer that to another business, or how all that kind of occurs?
So it's currently in the transfer of FDA approval. It's transfer between companies just within traditional M&A activity. In order for the actual FDA approval to be transferred, there's additional forms that need to be signed. It's not an active veto by the FDA. It's just another step in regulation of that. The bigger changes in terms of the doctrine that would be relevant, not just the transfer and that there's additional regulation, but if that new company that acquires the drug wants to stop selling it or change its selling it, say a competitor, say Ozempic acquires Wegovy and wants to stop one of them to increase their market share, there's substantial FDA regulation to stop them from not selling that drug in the future.
And does the FDA play a role in making sure that the assignee is qualified? Do they kind of do an investigation on that front or no?
I'm not sure exactly the level that they go into on that. Can't practically sell it to anybody, but I don't think they veto somebody if it's a smaller company. You have a question? Your question?
Oh, no.
No, so
Sorry.
no worries.
To inject that question about this transfer right from original company to the different company, second company. There is a lot of validation, verification, manufacturing, follow the GMP part or not. The FDA does require the process same scale as the first original approval. So the second company has to demonstrate FDA can audit them anytime during this transfer situation, or FDA will, if major impact society, this impact big drug, they will audit the second company, see if this manufacturing process follow the original approval or not.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, so even when you transfer the FDA approval, the requirements of the manufacturing process, of the manufacturing, how they do it, what their quality is, all of that carries. So it's not selling it and then changing the flavor like you may do for certain sodas or foods. It's going to have to be the exact same. They have to be able to meet those requirements to continue selling. So there's limits in terms of the transfer of rights itself. It's not a veto, but they have to be able to continue complying with FDA regulations to keep that drug on the market in that way. Yep.
So one of the arguments that applicants make for patents on property is because they only get granted you one right, which is the right to exclude. And obviously that the government grants you that right. Are there additional rights that FDA approval grants you that go with that bundle of six to further support why it should be viewed as property, even though patents aren't?
So there's two levels to that question. First is are patents property, and that itself is disputed. So patents have been called in some cases traditional types of property. They go back to the Constitution. There's arguments that they are private property because of certain private rights. But recent cases like oil states have suggested they're public franchises and not private property. So that comparison still fits in with this framework. So I argue that public franchises are the type of franchises discussed in Reich's article, and that they still satisfy the legitimate claim of entitlement. So yes, there are differences between patents and FDA approval. A lot of the design of them, with FDA approval being more focused on satisfying a standard, whereas patents have the non-obviousness, useful, more narrow set of circumstances. That changes some of the grant and supports patents being property rights even stronger in some ways. With the non-discretion, there's a lot more limitations in not granting a patent if they satisfy those requirements. So there is that difference in terms of the rights in the bundle. Yes, FDA approval is broader. It has marketing rights, where a patent, you don't have these affirmative rights to sell. You just have these exclusion rights. You have additional rights in terms of being able to market, to advertise. So in some ways, and on top of that, after a patent is expired, you don't have any rights to it. After FDA exclusivity expires, you still have the continued right to manufacture, just in a different scope, different marketing context. So to answer your question in a couple different ways, yes, there's more rights that are broader in FDA approval compared to patents, which I would say make it more property-like and more robust, so it supports that protection. But categorically, there are some differences in how patents have been recognized in property in their different theories, including more traditional ones that FDA approval doesn't quite fit. Yes.
Just quick question, for the Orange Book, FDA, they maintain whatever the book by FDA. So a lot of, company abuse that practice, file tons of patents, but they are some of not related to the patent in the drug. How do you comment on that?
Sure. So this is about the Orange Book. So when you have in this with your FDA approved medications, you have usually several, sometimes hundreds of patents that are attached to your product. FDA will track those patents that are limiting the ability to approve generic competition. So FDA's role in overseeing that has been really just administrative. It's not in charge of validating the veracity of those. There's been a lot of discussion about more collaboration between the PTO and the FDA in reviewing these patents to make sure they are valid, they are actually even related to this product. In terms of the actual property rights, I'm not sure how that would change it. I think that they're two separate buckets. And if we were to rely more on the FDA approval as opposed to patents, it could narrow the ability of manufacturers to take advantage because they're focusing on one drug as opposed to a bundle of patents or a whole suite of them. But it's definitely very interesting and difficult overlap between certain more patient protections and FDA levels.
Are there some other interesting topics and I'll you'd like to talk about?
Other interesting topics I'd like to talk about? Ooh. That's a dangerous one. The big one that I'll talk about is how this is leading to my next research projects. So a lot of the questions I've gotten in terms of presenting this work and working on it is, what's the actual scope of this risk? So we know that there are some drugs being withdrawn. We know that withdrawal could be a risk if it's politicized. We've seen discussions of mifepristone being FDA withdrawal taken away, the abortion medication. We've seen pushback on COVID vaccines at the federal and state level and trying to limit their access. So, a lot of these withdrawals are currently more theoretical worries. I wouldn't say they're not realistic given a lot of the different regulatory developments we've seen. But how much withdrawal are we already actually seeing, and what do these look like? How many of these cases are actually on this line between they could be safe, they could not be safe, they could be effective, they could not be. So I'm currently in the process with a couple of research assistants looking through all of these withdrawals to show first is how many withdrawals are actually taking place, which from what we've seen so far is surprisingly a lot. But what's the reason behind them? Most of them are companies saying they don't want to sell the drug anymore, or they're not selling the drug. So there's some concerns about this FDA approval, right, just not being used and why it's not being used. So I'm looking a lot into that aspect of withdrawals, as well as in those cases where there is pushback between the manufacturer and the FDA, what cases are we seeing these go to hearings or request hearings? So to really quantify the level of this risk. If we're going to require more protections for withdrawals of FDA approval, to what extent is this really a actual problem right now or something more forward-looking? So I'm doing quite a bit on that. So stay tuned for more work on withdrawals of FDA approval and what this means in terms of due process protections. So carrying on that, at this stage, I've said, yes, it's clearly can meet the test, or I argue it does, of a legitimate claim of entitlement. Now, if due process attaches, I've said it only goes to deprivation, so withdrawal, but what actually is required? Matthews versus Eldridge, the big due process case we see in con law, is interestingly in this whole line of legitimate claims of entitlement. It's about the withdrawal of disability benefits. So it's really in this new property space. And the case says that they only needed a post-deprivation hearing. Right now, we have generally pre-deprivation hearings or pre-withdrawal hearings for FDA approval. So if that's more than due process requires, is anything really changing? Do we need more? What else is going on? So this is just a really interesting area to keep watch on, seeing whether there's changes in the rights being granted under FDA approval, seeing whether there's changes at the FDA in terms of these hearings, and what this means for innovation and access to medicines overall.
Can consumers push back against withdrawals?
So they can, in some ways, push back, whether it be in citizens petitions or just providing additional data saying they don't want these drugs withdrawn. When FDA proposes a drug to be withdrawn, they have to put it in the Federal Register. So there's an opportunity for some commenting generally. But really, it tends to be a discussion narrowly between the manufacturers and the FDA, which is itself a problem. If a manufacturer is trying to stop selling a drug because they're not making enough money or they just don't want to be, they want to enter the business of, I don't know, chocolate. Maybe they are not doing it for the right reasons and there's still a substantial patient market. So patients may have different reliance, but still significant reliance interests in these drugs and their continued manufacturing. So what that means for patients' access to medicines rights and whether we can carry this on to something more patient-centric. Here, it's really relying on FDA approval as a manufacturing license, a license to market. But what does this mean for a patient's reliance on continued receipt of medications or ability to access them at all? We've seen some cases in the constitutional law context about patients' rights to unapproved medications. We haven't seen as much about continued approval for their rights. So that's another avenue that would be interesting to see, particularly when we're trying to get certain products more off the market or certain products have been raised as potential cures or treatments without evidence. So it's going to be a very interesting scope to watch going forward. Yes.
Sorry, I didn't quite follow that point. If I have FDA approval for a medication or whatever, does that also include the obligation to sell it in some fashion? I didn't.
So depending on, so if you are going to stop selling a drug and you are in a subset of sellers, there's like a very narrow availability of treatments for that condition. The FDA can require either not continued sale exactly, but the provision of generics and samples so that way there can be continued availability of that drug. So there's a limit on the FDA's ability, on a manufacturer's ability to just stop selling an FDA-approved medication if it falls in a certain statutory bucket. The language off that, I don't know off the top of my head,
Okay.
but there is some limitation there.
Would that mean the manufacturer itself would have to just approve generics or would have to continue?
I'm pretty sure it's that they need to provide samples and support some generic competition coming in. But the actual practical nature of that,
Sure, okay.
I think, just comment, FDA, a government has power to buy like aspirin, some, drugs they have to sell to the government, for the future, the war, whatever, storage, and company cannot just stop selling it, even though, it's not making money, but they are still making stuff for government, for future use, for aspirin stuff.
yeah, there's some like government purchases that are going to be limited. There's going to be some government involvement in the continued sale and availability of products anyways. But in terms of this narrow area, I don't think that it's going to be, it would be, the cases I'm more seeing are there's no other treatment available and a manufacturer wants to exit the market and there's no generic competition. That's really where the limits on the stopping sale is relevant.
I have a question.
Yes.
I didn't follow the news about Amgen compliance, FDA asked me to give up. But I heard the FDA has own, enforcement team, placement. They can just go to Walgreens, CVS, pull out the stuff. They think it's good for the market, for the public. Is that right?
I'm not exactly sure what you're referring to. So FDA.
Yeah, what if FDA thinks these drugs should be off the market? They just send people out to pull the stuff off the market.
Yeah,
right?
so part of FDA's enforcement authority is seizure. So if there is a drug that they say is unsafe or ineffective, we see that more in terms of recalls. So a lot of the time we'll see voluntary recalls where companies know that there's either contaminant or risk, or I saw it in the food recently, they had caffeine and caffeine-free coffee, and that was just devastating to the market. But for these products, the FDA can mandate recalls. Some of that can just be the stores will have to take it off the shelf and destroy it. Or it could be the case that they say it's not safe anymore, and they could go out and have people seize the drugs that are no longer legal. So it's part of their authority. I haven't seen that as raised as the biggest concern here, but it is possible that FDA would just start taking certain drugs off the shelf. I don't think that's the most realistic, but yes.
Is there any precedent for that in like recent memory though?
No, that's my point.
Yeah, okay.
So like FDA can't.
It's hard to imagine.
Exactly. It's very hard to imagine that being what actually is going to be the first solution. More likely, there is going to be hearings of a drug withdrawal. There's going to be pushback or discussion with the manufacturers. And then ultimately, it will say that this drug is no longer approved. When there is a withdrawal, it's about 6 months usually. They say that it's effective 6 months from now, absent like they're saying you're going to grow 3 heads and die, then those can be taken off quicker. But generally, they'll have some sunset period for them to sell off their continued product, especially if it's more of a business non-safety reason. And then they're just destroyed afterwards, usually by the pharmacies or whoever's in contact with them. So while there is certain seizure and other enforcement authority for FDA, something like going pharmacy door to door and stealing all my allergy medicine is not what I'm expecting to happen, which is good. If I start sneezing, nobody will hear for the next week. So we don't want that. Yes.
So Amgen called the case, FDA requests them to restore the drug from market. This request is not the order, is not carry the legal.
No, so this is an earlier stage. So the way that this can start is that they say, Amgen, we have this data. We're concerned about your drug based off of these studies, which is exactly what they did. They had a certain post-approval study that raised some risks on them meeting a certain endpoint. So they say based off that, they request them to voluntarily withdraw the drug from the market. Then if Amgen agrees, they can send a letter and say, we agree, we're going to take this off the market. We request you to withdraw our FDA approval. So that's what happens in a general sense. We see more commonly. As I've said, a lot of these withdrawal hearings and controversies are much rarer. So what's the next step here is that Amgen said, no, we don't want to. And then we can have the FDA set out a proposal to withdraw. And again, in the Federal Register saying that they are going to withdraw and that if Amgen wants to challenge it, which based off this, I would think they will, they can say, we want a hearing, we request opportunity for a hearing before the FDA commissioner, and we'll make our case. So that's where I would guess we're heading. There's still some latitude for the FDA to say, we believe in this study result. We think the study speaks for itself, and we're not going to change our mind. So a hearing is not required. That's where a lot of this due process type stuff that I'm talking about and more concerned about could come in, that if FDA says, no, we don't care what you have to say, we're going to make the same decision anyways, then this could possibly change that calculus. But as it is, it will be likely a publication in the Federal Register fairly soon by the FDA saying they want to withdraw the drug and they are going to require that. And then Amgen can request a hearing or not. Yes.
Are there conflicts with other territories like Europe or Asia, or do they kind of exist in separate spheres?
So there is some communication between the different regulators. For Amgen, for one, there's already been some review of this drug based in Europe based off of the same studies the FDA is concerned about. But the withdrawals are fairly independent. It's each agency's decision. There's some reciprocal approval policies and some communication between them, but it's really an FDA decision, not a FDA and EMA and so on. Well, with that, I thank everybody for coming. This was a pleasure. Thank you to everyone online. I hope you enjoyed this presentation. And I'll in here, if you have any questions, feel free to send me an email. It is right there. So thank you so much.